Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. In the house today, Tony Martignetti. Tony has been a long-time friend. I'm an admirer of his. We do a little bio. We're going to get into his latest book, and it's I tell you, talk about Campfire Lessons. So, Tony, let's introduce you first and get into some of my questions related to you and the book. So, Tony's a trusted advisor, leadership coach, facilitator, best-selling author, podcast host, and speaker. He brings together over 25 years of business and leadership experience and extreme curiosity. We're going to get into that to elevate leaders and equip them with the tools to navigate through change and unlock their true potential. Before becoming the founder and the chief inspiration officer of Inspired Purpose Partners, Tony was a finance and strategy executive with experience working with some of the leading life sciences companies. Along his journey, he also managed small businesses and ran a financial consulting company. Tony hosts the very popular and awesome the Virtual Campfire podcast, of which I've been delighted to be a guest on, and is the author of two books, Climbing the Right Mountain, Navigating the Journey to an Inspired Life, and what we'll get into today, Campfire Lessons for Leaders, How Uncovering Our Past Can Propel Us Forward. Tony's been featured in many, many different publications, including Fast Company, Forbes, Life Science Leader, and CEO Today. And get this, Thinkers 360 has recognized Tony as one of the top voices in leadership, also by the Leaders Hum as one of the biggest voices in leadership. Tony, great to see you again. All right, now let's get right to the meat of this. There's a running theme throughout the book that you call the 3 C's, and the 3 C's specifically of grounded leadership. And I thought we might as well start there to introduce people to the 3 C's, which are, I'll spoiler alert this, curiosity, compassion, and connection. So tell me a bit, and the listeners and viewers, why those 3 C's, came to manifest as kind of the arc through Campfire Lessons for Leaders.
Yeah, I love that you bring this up. First of all, thank you for a lovely introduction, and so great to see you again, Dan. I will say that those 3 C's have been present for me in my life and in the journey that I've been on for a long time. But then when I started to bring it into the view of what I wanted readers to experience as they went through this journey, is that when we look at our lives, when we look at our journey through life, we have to look at things through a different lens. We have to see it through this idea of what are the questions we're asking ourselves about our own experience. And sometimes we don't ask enough questions, enough honest questions about what's going on for me? Where have I been? Where am I going? What do I want to experience? And so that curiosity is an important lens to take on our journey. And so curiosity is a great starting point. But then when you take that next C into view, compassion is another very important piece. And this, right now, I've only talked about our personal piece, which is looking inwards, but compassion is about being compassionate about the dark sides and the challenging parts of our stories and saying, it's okay to have dark chapters, to have challenging journeys that have challenged us, but also that have helped us to become who we are, because that's part of the human experience. So compassion is a lens to see the world through. And then lastly, connection. Connection, I would say, is like the Uber one, because in order for us to be able to have a connection with others, we need to be able to have a connection with who we are and connecting with the story that we're willing to share and connect with. And so I think the key thing is to understand, once we've asked the questions, we've been compassionate with ourselves, how can we connect with that story that we're willing to narrate about who we are? And then you move outwards and say, now I'm ready to be compassionate, curious, and connect with others.
It's wonderful, Tony. It reminds me of another C word. These 3 C's, curiosity, compassion, and connection. They act as a centrifugal force throughout the pages of the book. And you touched on during the answer about compassion, sort of that dark side. And one of the things that you've done in the book, and maybe even within your business and your coaching and the consulting that you do, you sort of almost like you kind of like bring it up a bit in sort of one of your favorite quotes. And one of the favorite quotes you point out in the book is a Picasso quote, which is, of course, every act of creation begins with an act of destruction. And so I'm going to tease that out for you now and say, okay, so if that's one of your favorite quotes and you're alluding to this fact that there has to be, and there is, sorry, a dark side, like we go through darkness, and you're suggesting, well, actually, to be positive, there has to be negative, that to create, there has to be destruction, aka Picasso. Tell me a bit about that and how that informs the three C's and this centrifugal force within the campfires.
Yeah, I love that you bring this up because it's such a beautiful quote, and I love centrifugal. That's a word I'm gonna start to really lean into. I figured to bring up some nice college word, Dan. You're known for that. So the reason why this quote is so meaningful to me is because in order for us to kind of lean into the future that we're willing to have, we have to let go of some of the things that are holding us back, the weight of all of the things that have been like weighing us down and allowing us to stay stuck in place. And so that destruction is really about destroying all of the limiting beliefs, all the things that we've been led to believe are defining us. It means that we have to be able to include all the elements that we want to keep with us and understand what they are, but also allowing ourselves to free ourselves from that dark past, that the pieces that are holding us in place, and say, they don't define me, they're part of me, but they're just a part of who I am. And so that destruction is about, releasing yourself from the defining moments that are keeping you stuck, but also owning the pieces that you are keeping with you.
So do you think then, to sort of tangentially here, do you think that when people are making the leap from individual contributor, non-leader, to leader roles, that for some reason, Tony, that they find this need to embellish the hubris of their own perfection without going back and saying, yeah, you know what, actually, I'm kind of imperfect. And sidebar to that is, as they're leading and over the years, they're clearly making mistakes along the way. So help me understand, again, is it a continual destruction or recognition of some of the things we get wrong in order to be curious, compassionate, and connecting?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it in this context of like the learning and unlearning, it's like, we're constantly in this cycle of, I learned something new, and here's what I believe, and here's how the world works. And then realizing that we don't know how the world works, and we're going to be open-minded to what's possible and what's available to us. And so when we come into a new position or new place in our lives, we got to be able to stay in that place of, okay, just because I had learned that this is how the world works in the past, doesn't mean it's going to allow me to continue to be that way in the future. And it also means that I can take the pieces that I do know will carry with me. So if I learned a lesson about every time I walk into a room and I yell at people, they don't react positively. Well, guess what? Maybe I'll stop doing that and see if I get a different result by acting differently in the way that I interact with people, especially now that I might be in a leadership role, and realizing that my every action, every word is amplified. So it's a learning lesson, but it's also realizing that every time I learn something, what else do I have to learn? What's the next part of my curve I'm on?
Well, it reminds me of Newton's third, right? Every action has an opposite and equal reaction, and that's kind of the point of leadership. If you're an arse or terrible and are treating people without compassion, not connecting, and certainly not having that courage to sort of understand what people are as a human, got it. It's going to be a ripple effect, the opposite and negative way, and you're creating more negativity, more destruction, aka Picasso. Okay, I want to read a passage from the book.
Oh boy.
Get your thoughts on this, and then ask a question. So here it goes. So I always love this because you're like, did I write that? Did I really write that? Yeah. Okay. I reflected on the idea that sitting in discomfort is a good thing, as you will read in the stories in this chapter. If we always got what we wanted immediately without challenge or obstacles, we would experience no joy in attaining it. Would it still feel rewarding if our journey through life was easy? On the contrary, we value things more than when overcoming adversity to achieve them. That is why the view at the top of a mountain can be breathtaking after a challenging climb. Experiencing challenges helps us prepare to move forward. It broadens our range of what is possible and reminds us once again that we are resilient people who can meet our challenges head on and survive each and every one. Now, I've lifted that passage because we're kind of on this thread right now within this interview of the dichotomy between destruction and construction, or negative and positive. So I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, what have you learned about this sitting in the discomfort and then knowing that there's work to do in order to get comfortable, but there's learnings along the way, as you're suggesting throughout the book. So I'm not going to continue to ask about the dichotomy, but I think it's important because you're doing such a good, Judas to Jesus, black to white, 1 to 0 work within the book itself.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I just love that you pulled out that passage, because I think it's what I needed to hear at this very moment, because I'm constantly in this place of feeling like, where am I most needing to stretch? Where do I need to most sit in discomfort so that I'm ready for that next leap into the unknown? Because the future is always uncertain for everyone, right? Myself included. And so when I hear that passage, I think of this idea that when we sit in discomfort, it allows us to think about, all right, what am I learning right now in this moment that's preparing me to grow into the next person I'm meant to be, and to allow myself to prepare for that next chapter in my book of life. And I think that that learning for me is a sense of like, if it didn't have challenges, then I'd be sitting here and saying like, oh, this is nice. I can start to really cruise along and just enjoy the spoils of my book I just wrote and just enjoy it. Reality is I want to make sure that I'm continuing to stay really on my sharp edge of growth and say, hey, what do I do with this? How do I use it? How do I use it as a gift and not as as something that gets in the way of my future potential? Just like everyone I coach and work with, I want them to see that their potential is unlimited, and that unlimited growth comes from sitting in the reality that you're not at your peak, that you still have ways to go. And you can also celebrate how far you've come by saying, this is great, but I know that if if I sit in discomfort, if I sit on my edge, I can learn where I'm going to next.
Reminds me a bit of a Churchill quote, actually. Churchill wrote, I might be paraphrasing, but hopefully my recall is pretty good. To improve is to change, but to be perfect is to change often. Which is another way to say, there's no such thing as perfection, because we should be always continuously improving. It's sort of like we should be continuously dissatisfied with the status quo, not because we want to be perfect, but because we want to learn. Is that a fair observation, what you're trying to get at?
Exactly. I mean, to borrow a phrase also from someone who's featured in the book, but also a fellow friend of ours, is Whitney Johnson, is growth is our default setting. Yeah. And if you think about it in that way, is that if we're not growing, then we've stopped kind of being in our human nature. And when you think about growth as being a constant process of changing and evolving. And I think that's the thing that we need to lean into is how am I growing today? What am I doing today that allows me to lean into the next person who I'm meant to be? Even if that means it's a small incremental change, if we stop growing, then we've stopped being human.
Indeed. So here's a growth tangentially and slightly different but divergent point. Still on the book.
Mm-hmm.
I went and checked my 5 books if I had ever used the word flashpoints. And it turns out after 400,000 plus words of books, I have never used the word flashpoints. Yet in your book, you've used the word flashpoints, I think it was about 42 times.
Yes.
So I need you to A, define flashpoints for listeners and viewers. B, tell me why that found such a nested home inside of the book. And what's the relationship, the moments between kind of one's personal and professional growth when we're talking about this point of flashpoints.
Yeah, I love that you bring this up because it's such it's to me, it's a really beautiful word that needs to get some more air coverage, if you will, as you can say. But first of all, I'll just give its origin for me was, it came from the podcast, the Virtual Campfire, where, that's the question I'm often asking people is that we're going to explore your flashpoint through your life, that moment that has ignited your gifts into the world. It's that moment where life has changed, where you might have had been going along with the light turned off, and then all of a sudden something ignites and changes and creates something new for you. And what's interesting about flashpoints is that it might not be as sudden as we expect. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer to really illuminate to the level we want it to be, or the level it gets to in our lives. But it's still a flashpoint. So the idea of this, fire, has a flashpoint moment where all of a sudden it's just, it's come alive. So that's where I came up with the idea of using it as an imagery for my podcast, but also, using it for a way for people to think about their stories and think about what was that moment that changed me, and it was not going to allow me to go back to where I was before. It wasn't going to allow me to turn back and think differently, and think the same way. I had to change my thinking and create a different me than I was before. So,
well, interestingly, you can't have a campfire without a flash point.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so ironically, though, you also make mention in the book that we really have to be looking at our past. Like we need to be integrating these past experiences, and you can't just always be anew and start from scratch and everything is a green field. So this notion in the book, Tony, is that you say, look, the understanding, the integration of our past into our present is actually fundamental to growth. So tell me a bit about what you learn and what you advocate for in the process that enhances, our effectiveness and even our authenticity, as humans.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this concept, one of the most important parts about this is that oftentimes I've run into people who have said like, well, I don't like to look back in the past and think about the things I was because, that was the old me, or that was a part of me that I don't really like to think about or talk about. And I'm like, well, why? Let's talk about it because, the reality is that was something we should honor. And even if it is a darkness, there's parts of that darkness that made us who we are. And so therefore we should understand it. And so the reason why it's powerful is because you want to take away the gifts from that piece, that part of your life. I'll give you a very kind of benign example, but I'll use an example of myself. I was a finance executive, and the reality is that I was like, I'm never going back to working in numbers. But the reality is I honor that. And I realized that was a building block of who I am. And it allowed me to understand the way of business and connect with people who are analytical and help them to see things beyond their edges of the analytical mind and see things in a more artistic and creative way, and realize that there are different perspectives to see the world through.
Mm-hmm.
So by me saying, hey, I'm not a finance executive any longer, but I also can play with that world. I even use a lot of like the language from the old days of like measured risk, ROI, but my ROI nowadays is return on inspiration, not return on investment. So yeah, I think it's important.
You are a chief inspiration officer, so I would hope that the ROI has changed.
Exactly. But I mean, I'll go off the tangent for now, but just to say that, like, I think it's really important to look back and make sure that you don't just throw away even the elements of our childhood, which can be, really, pretty far back, that sometimes define who we are today. Like, I've interviewed people who have said, like, yeah, even when I was a child, I realized that there was something about me that was different, and that I, didn't know this was going to turn out to be. But now when I look at the work I do today, I realize this is exactly who I was meant to be. I just lost my way for a number of years.
Well, if we continue this metaphor within the campfire point, we've talked about the flashpoints. Even in this sort of looking back, we would probably want to look back at past attempts to put together a campfire, and how we screwed that up. One of the other things you talk about are micro steps to kind of transformation. And so in the book, you kind of suggest that a lot of our change and growth starts with these small actions, which lead to creating significant work and life kind of changes. So you touched on the, being a finance executive. So those were, you've, in your career, you've had these small steps along the way to get to being author, leadership strategist, podcast supreme podcaster, and so on and so on. So what can others learn from the point about the micro steps? And my point back to the metaphor of the campfire is that you can't have a raging inferno, awesome, let's put marshmallows on the fire type of fire, without having the micro steps, right? Of, well, what's the ground like? Do we have air? Do we have kindling? Is there a little bit of newspaper maybe? Anyone got a match, right? And then do we have good logs afterwards? So tell me a bit about the micro steps metaphorically to transformation ultimately.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind around that is just this idea that we have to have an explorer's mindset around how we're looking at things. And it doesn't have to be that, we make a decision and we're going 100 miles an hour towards it. Sometimes it's about, hey, something's happening here, or something in my day-to-day has me questioning and thinking differently. And I'm going to get curious and compassionate and connect with this thing. So those 3 C's come into play. But the explorer's mindset is really just like, I'm going to explore this idea with an open mind and see what potentially this could be. And if it is, as I turn over more cards or take more steps, that it could be something bigger than what I initially thought. So maybe it starts with a simple exploration of having a few conversations. Like, maybe, you start to explore this idea of, I could be a person who writes a book. And before you start writing a book, you may want to say, like, oh, have I ever written an article? Or maybe I should talk to some authors and see what the process looks like. And so it's having those moments where you can start to see, what are some things I can do to put myself in the trajectory of making sure that that's even a reality for me, or a possibility. So, yeah. So
a couple of questions to end with. So Campfire Lessons for Leaders, we haven't even said yet, is actually rooted in the discovery process that you had by interviewing a cadre of really cool people and gleaning insights from them and using your own experience and your work to kind of come up with the 3 C's. So question I have for you, penultimate question, is between the sort of 3 C's of curiosity and compassion and connection, tell me, like, what's the maybe one thing you've learned that you'd say, hey, you're an up and coming leader, I want you to leave with this, with the first C, the second C, the third C?
Yeah, I would say in addition to the three C's, the things that are really important for leaders to glean from this is that we have to be a little more open with sharing who we are as we connect with ourselves. And I think, it's really important. If I think about the book in at its core, it's about connecting with our story and then connecting with ourselves more authentically and real to know, hey, who am I really? And why am I doing the work that I'm doing? And what makes me do what I do? And then ultimately, how can I use that as a way to connect with others? And so I think that's what the call is here for leaders, is to find ways to connect better. And to do that, it's to know yourself, and to become more aware. And I think one of the things that is really important to point out is at the end of the book, I have a call to action to say, like, let's have more campfires of connection where people can come together and share their stories. And I think that's what my true aim is to have people get to know themselves better and then get to know other people better, because we need better connection.
Well, I don't know if you knew what I wanted to get to in terms of my last question, but it was literally that. It's like, okay, Tony, what's your story? Let us know what it is that you want to leave people with, to say, here's who I am, and here's what I've learned through the writing of this particular book. What's your story?
Yeah, I mean, you basically hit, we've already pretty much covered that, but let me go a little deeper and just share some things about this. Is that I think that my biggest takeaway that I want to give people from this book is just that connection is what we crave the most. I mean, you've touched on it in your book, your latest book, Work-Life Bloom, which I think is just brilliant. But I think one of the things that is so important is we need to change the way that we interact with each other at this moment. And I think the biggest thing is we can't just stay at the surface level. We have to connect at a deeper level. We're all craving it, and we have to find ways to do it that is allowing ourselves to feel fulfilled in our interactions. And so what that means for me is that we need to create a way for people to talk about what's most important for them, and hopefully creating campfires of connection through getting to know each other and know ourselves is a way to really start the conversation. No pun intended.
If the Chief Surgeon General of the U.S., Dr. Vivek Murthy, has suggested that isolation and loneliness are sort of the new smoking for Americans, I think an antidote for that would be this book, Tony. It speaks volumes to the power of that curiosity, compassion, of course, connection. All right, where can we find out more about Sir Tony and all your work?
Well, thank you so much. You can find me at my website, which is ipurposepartners.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn, which I'm pretty active. And of course, you can find my book wherever books are sold. You can find both my books there. So thank you so much.
Tony, it's a delight to know you, but to have you here and to riff a bit on this particular awesome piece of work that you've put into the public domain. Hat tip and kudos to you on that. We need more Tonys in this world that are really trying to help shape an elevated path, ultimately through the forest to get to your campsite, to have better campfire conversations with people. How about that? Sound good?
Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
All right, folks. It's been another episode of Leadership Now with me, Dan Pontefract. Thanks so much, Tony. We'll get all those details, et cetera, into the show notes. And thanks again.